I'm Bronwyn Williams. This is Tumelo Mojapelo. We're from Flux Trends, and we're busy with some what we're calling 15-minute foreplay conversations. So we talk to thought leaders and leaders in the futures and foresight space about some of the most helpful mental models when it comes to thinking about the future. And today we've got Tyler with us, and we want to ask you, Tyler, can you explain how the brain functions as a prediction machine?
Sure. Thanks. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, so there is a principle of we call it like free energy out there, and it's this idea that the brain is trying to constantly predict what's going to happen in the world based on current models that it has in the brain, and then by sensing the external world, get information and data, and then update that model. And so the idea is it's constantly trying to predict what's going to happen in the world, and then update that model so it uses less energy, really mainly though so it has less uncertainty is one of the key concepts, or less surprise. So the idea is that the brain wants to make the world very more and more certain over time so that it can make better and better predictions.
So you're talking about how the brain is trying to deal with this uncertainty in the world. I just want to ask you, just to understand clearly. So what you're basically saying that we have everything we need in our minds to be able to not predict, but apply futures thinking in our everyday context, correct? Am I understanding that correctly?
That is correct, yes. And so within, I guess the idea is that within the brain, we have a lot of different systems that are constantly working. So aside from like prediction models of how the brain works, there's quite a few other models out there. One of the ones I'm looking at heavily is called the global neural workspace model of the brain. And what that model looks at is it says there's 5 different systems out there that we have inside the brain. The first system is our memory system. The second one is our perception system, which we are using in prediction. The third one is our attention system. The fourth is our values or evaluation system. And the final one is anticipatory system. And the idea is all these systems are kind of competing and collaborating to discover what's the right information or data based on the context, and then how we should create a future frame, right? Kind of an image of the future based on that data, whether that be in the immediate present or long-term, into the future as well. And these future frames are then deciding what types of resources we should allocate to creating that future, what kind of risks and opportunities that are out there. And so really, I think, at least the models I like to work on, is we need to understand like how all those systems are providing data information to make predictions about the future. And it's not just that there's one model, because each one of those systems kind of has a different model of how it's seeing the world. So it makes it a little more complex with the brain. I think the free energy principle of the brain is a kind of a very simple model that we can use and look at as far as being able to predict what's happening just based on sensory data. I don't know if it's robust enough to really get the full picture of what's happening. I think it really relies on kind of a very primitive understanding of the brain. For example, amoebas, which don't have brains, although some amoebas do eat brains, but they don't have brains. And they're basically trying to make predictions about the world through chemotaxis, which is this idea that they're looking at chemical gradients to decide, which ways to go. So not really making so much predictions as they're just following chemical gradients as a starting point. And then we get more, I guess, robust cognitive functioning over time as we go into animals and then humans. And so I think the predictive model is kind of I would say more of a more primitive model of the brain. And I think we need to move into more complex models for really understanding how we think about the future, but also if we want to develop like artificial intelligence, machine learning to a level that can really start to understand the future in a more, I guess, human-aligned way. Right? If we just rely on the predictive models of the brain, which is kind of just an anticipatory model in some sense too, then we're kind of cutting out a lot of these features of the brain that are also important. For example, our values as humans, or how we see ourselves in the future. So one of the interesting things is as you start to look into the future and start to imagine yourself in the future and start to make predictions about what happens, is the further into the future you go, the less likely you're able to understand that future as being your future. It actually is seen as maybe somebody else's future. And so you start to predict like what's going to happen for somebody else, but then that's not as relevant to you, right? And so you're less likely to really be concerned about that future or allocate resources to developing it or taking advantage of the opportunities or avoiding the risks.
So I'm going to ask two questions in one. The first
Sure.
question is, which model then would you advise leaders who are in an uncertain, so like a model that need to use to make decisions, and not necessarily short-term decisions, long-term decisions? And then secondly, how do you bridge the gap between your other self, because I want to call it that, so your present self and your future self that's not really someone you can identify with? How do you form a connection in such a way that if you are imagining a future that you're going to exist in the future, because I think we're constantly becoming who we are, right? How do you maybe create a link or bring that close enough for you to be invested in the decisions that you make for the future? Because you brought us two points. I'm so sorry if...
No problem, great.
Okay.
So the first one on, when to use, like different models and when to use like maybe just a simple predictive model of the future. I think with that, well, for me, when it comes to reducing surprise or uncertainty in the world, to me, those are just feelings, right? So uncertainty is just a feeling. I mean, it's not really we call it like a statistic a lot of times or a probability maybe, but for me, it's just a feeling we have. And so when we're dealing with uncertainty, I think we have to realize we're dealing with feelings, and the brain is also kind of dealing with feelings, right? It's like trying to minimize that uncertainty so it feels safe in the world, right? Or that it can trust its decisions. So I think and also I think what's interesting too about foresight and future is that we're actually introducing a lot of uncertainty when we start to explore the future, right? So the nature of foresight is to engage with uncertainty. So if the model we're trying to use is just to reduce uncertainty, right? Look at the free principle model and trying to predict the future and reduce uncertainty. I don't know if we're really trying to do foresight so much, right? Maybe we're trying to do forecasting a lot of times. So I think if you're trying to do forecasting, and I also would say if you're trying to do it in the short term, then maybe that prediction model could help you out. Although we have to be careful because just some good research out there. I don't know if you ever read the book Super Forecasting by Tetlock, right in there, and he talks about how forecasters are basically as good as dart throwing chimpanzees, right? So if we're using foresight just as a predictive mechanism, I don't know if we're using it to its fullest capacity and capability. So that's why we're working on this model of the global workspace. We think it's more robust and has a lot of the pieces that we really do need to consider when we're thinking about how the brain works. And just simply like we look at a story back in, I think it was 1950s or so, when there was a guy named H.M. I don't know if you've ever heard the story of him, but there was a scientist that wanted to research H.M. because H.M. is this patient, they call him, that had epileptic seizures since he was a little child. And so what he did is the doctor went in and actually started to remove parts of his brain. And he removed the hippocampus part. And what they found out was that, yes, the epileptic seizures went away, but also HM lost his memory. He could basically hold it for maybe 5 minutes, okay? So he lost his memory. He was able to actually engage in procedural memory. So he could trace stars over time and he'd get better and better at it, but he couldn't remember like semantic or episodic memories. And also he had a hard time like thinking into the future, and he couldn't imagine himself in the future. He could kind of create these very general understandings of the future, but he could not imagine himself. So when we look at that kind of history of the brain and how it works, we think the hippocampus is a really important component there. And if you look at it that way, it says that the brain really thinks of the future as three things. The first thing is it sees the future as a memory, right? So not just episodic memory, but prospective memory as well. And the brain also sees the future as a place. So that actually links into the role of the hippocampus as a navigation tool. And animals, one of the main things they use foresight for is navigation, right? Kind of predicting and understanding where they're trying to get to, where resources might be. And the final thing is the future is a feeling. So the hippocampus actually integrates sensory and motor information so that we can kind of feel, what the future's like before we make a step or before we move the body. Okay, so when we start to look at more robust models, we use this as maybe the foundation of understanding how the brain might think about the future, and then we expand and grow from there. And I think this also relies a lot on this piece here, your other second part of your question, which is around how do we bridge that gap between ourself now in the present and ourself in the future, right? Which is, I think, a really important piece that's kind of missing in a lot of foresight too. It's understanding the reality that if we just think about the foresight future generally, it doesn't connect to us, then our brain does not want to allocate resources to actually create that future. It doesn't stimulate like a real, like robust connection between the values and who we think we are as a person and the future we're trying to create. So it doesn't register as our future, right? So I think a lot of the futures we're creating, we'd even say are kind of disembodied futures, right? So that our body doesn't connect with it in any way. Sure, mentally we think about it, but it doesn't have that neurophysiological connection. And really that's what I think one of the roles of foresight is actually to help us create neurophysiological connections to the future. So we are kind of pulled in that future in the sense that we want to allocate resources. We'd rather be in that future than the present moment. But it's a neurophysiological thing. It's a resource management, internal resource management component that we're kind of missing. So to bridge the gap, I think, it's not only about like thinking into the future, but it's also imagining yourself in the future. And then one of the key components in there is what are the values that you're going to have in the future, right? So that's one of the key things. Values, or one way to think about values, is they allow for continuity of self over time, right? So, for example, if I imagine myself in the future and I have totally different values, then I'm a totally different person, right? And I'm going to register that as a totally different person as well. So but we have to be able to understand, like, our values are going to change, but we have to understand like how they're going to change and why that's still relevant to us now, even though we might not hold those values. And then the other part of it is actually taking the time to think into the future a lot and to constantly imagine yourself being in that future and to stimulate as much senses as you can. So doing exercises where you might, like, okay, you're in that space. So for example, I did some work with Rolls-Royce years ago, and I said, okay, we don't know what the innovation is we're trying to create. Let's go into the future where that innovation has been created already, and let's really imagine ourselves there. And instead of focusing on the innovation, we focused on the place we were in, because that's going to stimulate certain neurons that we need to stimulate. It's going to start to stimulate the sensory motor system as well. Let's walk around. What do we see? What are we feeling? And then from that space or that place and the connection to the sensory motor system, then new ideas might start to emerge.
Thank you so much.
And I think the key thing is, then is we're actually more connected to that future then, and our future self is actually there.
I like that you're bringing in the 5 senses, because so it's memory, it's your 5 senses, and also some values. I mean, you're not going to carry all your values, so maybe the most core value that you'll have to bridge the gap between your present self and your future self. Thank you so much for your time and your insight. Really appreciate it. For those who are following us, please stay tuned, continue to subscribe, and join us for more 15-minute foreplay conversations. Thank you. Thank you, Tyler.
Thank you, Tubi. Thank you, Bronwyn.